The glass of amber liquid arced through the afternoon sun, a grotesque jewel against the impossibly green lawn of Harmony Creek Estates. It wasn't aimed at my son, not directly. It was aimed at his feet, at the thick-soled, heavily braced orthopedic shoes that allowed him to walk without pain. The splash was quiet, almost delicate, but the sound that followed was not. A sizzle sharp and venomous as the liquid struck the worn leather. A faint, acrid smoke, smelling of bitter almonds and burnt plastic, curled into the pristine air. Leo froze, his 10-year-old body rigid with a fear that went far beyond the usual anxieties of childhood. His gaze dropped to his shoes, his anchors to the world now steaming with a malevolent vapor. He didn't scream. He made a small wounded sound in the back of his throat, a noise that shattered my world more completely than any shout ever could. Across the perfect manicured lawn stood Carol, her face a mask of triumphant righteousness. She held the now empty tumbler in a hand adorned with a gaudy diamond ring. Her lips were pursed into a thin line of satisfaction. "There," she said, her voice carrying across the lawn with the clarity of a church bell. "Now, maybe they'll stop stinking up our neighborhood." Something cold and ancient woke up inside me. It was a familiar feeling, a professional calm, that settled over the inferno of a father's rage. I pushed Leo gently behind me, my body a shield. My eyes didn't leave Carol, but my senses were cataloging everything. The approximate volume of the liquid, maybe 150 milliliters. The color, a pale amber. The distinct odor profile, not just a simple corrosive. The way it fumed on contact with the leather, and the grass, a specific aggressive reaction. "Leo, go inside," I said, my voice dangerously even. "Now. Don't run. Walk to the back door. Don't touch your shoes." He looked at me, his eyes wide pools of confusion and hurt. He trusted that tone, though. He'd heard it on the rare occasions I took work calls from home. It was the voice that meant things were serious. He nodded, turned, and walked with his careful, measured gait toward our house, leaving the steaming shoes on the grass. I took a step forward. Carol held her ground, a petty tyrant on her manicured throne. "You're a menace bringing that filth here," she spat. "This is a respectable community." "That was a glass of acid, Carol." I said, the words falling like ice chips into the warm air. She scoffed, a brittle, ugly sound. "It's just a strong cleaner, to get rid of the smell. You should be thanking me." I kept walking toward her, my pace unhurried. The professional part of my brain was working furiously, isolating variables, constructing a preliminary analysis. The rage was still there, a white-hot core, but it was contained, fueling the cold machine of my training. I am a state investigator. My specialty is chemical crimes. And this woman in her tennis whites and pearl earrings had just declared war on my son, using my own field of expertise as her weapon. She had no idea who I was. She had no idea what she had done. Our life in Harmony Creek had been an attempt at quiet normalcy. After my wife passed, it was just me and Leo. I wanted a place for him that was safe, predictable, where the grass was always cut, and the biggest drama was whose petunias won the Garden of the Month award. I could afford it, and Leo deserved the illusion of a perfect world, even if I knew better. The shoes were a part of our daily ritual. Every morning after his stretches, I'd help him. The thick socks, the custom-molded insoles, the heavy leather braced with steel and composite materials. They were expensive, a feat of medical engineering, and they were his freedom. Without them, each step was a negotiation with pain. With them, he could walk to the community pool. He could go to the park. He could almost keep up with the other kids. They were clunky, yes. They made a distinct, heavy sound on the pavement. And after a long day of a 10-year-old boy wearing them, perhaps they didn't smell like a rose garden. But they were a part of him. Carol's reign over the Harmony Creek Homeowners Association was absolute. She was a woman who found her life's purpose in the fine print of bylaws. Her first notice had arrived a month after we moved in. A crisp, cream-colored envelope slid under our door. It was a formal warning about non-compliant visual standards regarding footwear, left on the front porch. I had left Leo's shoes outside to air out for 10 minutes. I brought them in and thought nothing more of it. The second notice came a week later. A fine for $50. Violation of olfactory regulations as per HOA Covenant 7.4b. Pervasive or unpleasant odors emanating from a private residence. I paid it just to avoid a confrontation. I started keeping the shoes in the garage. But Carol's obsession grew. She would see us walking to the community mailbox, and her nose would wrinkle in an exaggerated display of disgust. She'd make comments just loud enough for me and a few other neighbors to hear. Some people have no consideration for shared airspace. You'd think for the price of these houses we'd be spared certain unpleasantries. I ignored her. I told Leo to ignore her. He was a sensitive boy, a quiet soul who preferred drawing fantastical creatures in his sketchbook to playing sports. He already felt different because of his leg. Carol's campaign of petty tyranny was a constant grinding reminder of that difference. The first major escalation happened at the annual 4th of July barbecue by the community pool. We had found a quiet table, and Leo had taken his shoes off, tucking them neatly under his chair. He wanted to dip his feet in the water. Carol marched over a plate of perfectly arranged deviled eggs in one hand. "Absolutely not," she announced, her voice silencing the chatter at 3 nearby tables. I looked up. "Excuse me." "Those," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the shoes under the chair. "They are a health hazard, and the smell is putting people off their food." The air crackled with tension. A few people stared, then quickly looked away, suddenly fascinated by their potato salad. "Carol, they are medical equipment," I said, keeping my voice low. "And they're under the chair. No one is near them." "I am near them. We are all near them. This is a community event. It's for everyone, not for your son's stinking shoes to ruin." Leo's face crumpled. He pulled his feet from the water, his cheeks burning with shame. He reached for his shoes, his movements jerky and small. "We'll just go," I said, standing up, my own plate untouched. I helped Leo put his shoes back on, my hands trembling with suppressed fury. As we walked away, I could feel dozens of eyes on our backs. No one said a word. No one met my gaze. They were all afraid of Carol, of being the next target of her suffocating brand of order. That night, Leo tore a page out of his sketchbook and threw it away. It was a drawing of a boy with rocket shoes, flying over a row of identical houses. The next incident was even more brazen. I was bringing in groceries from the car. Leo had gone inside ahead of me, leaving his shoes on the doormat just inside the open garage for a moment. When I came back for the last bag, Carol was standing at the edge of our driveway. She was holding a pair of long metal barbecue tongs, and in their grip was one of Leo's shoes, held out like a piece of contaminated waste. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, dropping the bag of groceries. A carton of milk split open on the concrete. "I am enforcing the bylaws," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "These were left in a common view area, constituting a biohazard. I am disposing of them." She started walking toward the community trash receptacle at the end of the street. "Put the shoe down, Carol," I said, my voice dropping to a growl. "You have been warned repeatedly," she said, not breaking her stride. I ran and cut her off, standing between her and the bin. For a moment, we just stood there, a bizarre suburban standoff. A middle-aged woman in a pastel tracksuit holding my son's $1,000 medical device in a pair of tongs. "Give me the shoe," I said. "You and your boy are a blight on this community." She hissed, her face contorting with a rage that seemed far too large for the situation. "You don't belong here." I snatched the shoe from the tongs. Our fingers brushed, and she recoiled as if she'd been burned. She stared at me, her eyes filled with pure venom, and then she turned and marched back to her own pristine house, the tongs still held aloft like a defeated scepter. That was 2 days ago, and now here we were. The sizzle on the grass had stopped. A dark, ugly stain was spreading on the leather of Leo's shoe. My professional mind took over completely. I walked past Carol into my garage. I returned with a chemical spill kit, a standard issue case I keep in my car. She watched me, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes for the first time. "What is that?" she asked. I didn't answer. I put on a pair of nitrile gloves and safety glasses. I used a set of sterile forensic tongs to pick up the shoe. The acid had eaten through the top layer of leather, exposing the composite material beneath. It had started to melt that too. I placed it carefully into a hazardous materials evidence bag. Then, I used a sampling swab to collect a specimen from the grass. I took another swab from the remaining drops on the pavement. I took a photo of the damage that stained the location. Finally, I walked over to the tumbler she had dropped on her own lawn. I picked it up with a separate set of tongs, careful not to smudge any potential prints, and placed it in its own evidence bag. Through it all, I was silent. My movements were precise, economical, and utterly devoid of emotion. Carol was no longer defiant. She was confused. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had expected yelling, crying, a satisfyingly dramatic scene. She was getting a cold, methodical process she didn't understand. "I'm going to call the police," she stammered, trying to regain control, "for your threatening behavior." "I wouldn't do that," I said, turning to face her fully for the first time. I peeled off my gloves. "Because the first thing they'll do is secure the scene. And the second thing they'll do is call my office." I pulled my wallet from my back pocket. I flipped it open to my credentials. The gold shield of the State Bureau of Investigation gleamed in the sun. Underneath it, my title: Senior Investigator, Chemical Crimes and Response Unit. Her face went slack. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of old parchment. The triumphant righteousness was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. She wasn't looking at her angry neighbor anymore. She was looking at the state. "The substance you used," I said, my voice flat, clinical, "is not a simple cleaner. Based on the fuming, the reaction with organic material, and the faint odor of benzaldehyde, my preliminary assessment is that you used a solution of hydrofluoric acid, likely mixed with a nitric acid carrier. It's not something you can buy at the store, Carol. It's an industrial dissolving agent used for etching silicon wafers. It eats leather, plastic, metal. It also eats flesh and bone. A small amount absorbed through the skin can cause cardiac arrest and death." Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "You threw a glass of it at my son." I continued, the cold fury now seeping into my words. "You attempted to destroy his medical equipment, a device essential to his mobility. You did this on purpose, with premeditation. You've been escalating this for months." I took a step closer. She took a step back, stumbling on her own perfect lawn. "So you can call the police if you like. But I'm going to make a different call. I'm going to call my lab supervisor and get a priority analysis on these samples. I'm going to call the federal database and cross-reference distributors of controlled chemical agents. I'm going to find out who bought it, when they bought it, and how it ended up in that tumbler." I held up the bagged piece of evidence. "And then, the state of this fine union is going to prosecute you. Not for vandalism, not for assault, but for the unlawful possession and deployment of a chemical weapon against a disabled minor. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go check on my son." I turned my back on her and walked into my house, leaving her standing alone on the lawn, a ghost in her own perfect kingdom, the world she had built on rules and regulations crumbling around her, under the weight of a crime she was too arrogant to even understand she was committing. The inside of the house was quiet. Leo was in his room, sitting on his bed. His sketchbook was open on his lap, but his pencil was still. He was just staring at the blank page. The other shoe, the one that had been spared, sat on the floor beside him, looking lonely and incomplete. I sat down next to him. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just put my arm around his small shoulders and pulled him close. He leaned against me, and I could feel the tension in his body, the tremor of a sob he was trying to hold back. "She melted it," he whispered, his voice thick. I know, I said. We'll get new ones. I like those ones. He said, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down his cheek. They were broken in. My own throat felt tight. It wasn't about the shoe. It was about the violation, the cruelty, the simple, ugly fact that a grown woman had tried to destroy something that helped him all for the sake of her own twisted sense of order. The new ones will be even better. I promised, my voice rough with emotion. I'll make sure of it. He was quiet for another moment. Then he asked, what you were doing with the bags and the glasses. That was my work, buddy, I said. Sometimes when people do something very wrong with dangerous things, my job is to figure out exactly what they did. Is she in trouble? I looked at his earnest, worried face. Yes, Leo, I said. She's in very big trouble. The next morning, the lab results confirmed my field assessment. A 12% solution of hydrofluoric acid in a nitric acid base. Highly corrosive, highly toxic, and absolutely illegal for any individual to possess without extensive licensing and safety protocols. The digital trail was laughably easy for my team to uncover. Carol was too arrogant to be clever. She hadn't used her husband's credit card directly. She had used a prepaid gift card, but she'd used her home computer to purchase it. The IP address was a direct link, and the online chemical supply company she'd bought the acid from was a shady fly-by-night operation based overseas that was already on a federal watch list for selling to unauthorized buyers. They kept poor records, but they kept enough. An order for 2 liters of glass etching solution shipped to a third-party mail drop, an hour from our town, paid for with the gift card she had bought. It was a flimsy chain of cover-ups easily broken. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for that evening. The email sent by the board secretary was terse, mandatory all-resident meeting regarding the incident at 124 Willow Lane. Your attendance is required. Carol, it seemed, was not going down without a fight. She was going to try and control the narrative to paint herself as the victim. The community clubhouse was packed. The air was thick with tension and the scent of nervous perfume. I saw faces from the barbecue people who had watched in silence. They wouldn't meet my eyes now either. Carol and her husband, a pale, nervous man named Robert, sat at the head table. Carol looked composed, her face set in an expression of pained solemnity. She had dressed for the part in a conservative navy blue dress. She stood up and began to speak, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. My dear friends and neighbors, she began, I have called this meeting because of a terrible, terrible misunderstanding that has threatened the peace and safety of our community. As you know, I have dedicated myself to maintaining the standards that make Harmony Creek a desirable place to live. Yesterday, in my attempt to address a long-standing and unpleasant sanitary issue, I was confronted. I was threatened. She paused, dabbing a dry eye with a handkerchief. Mr. Henderson, our new neighbor, became aggressive. He has a temper. He accused me of things, horrible things. All I did was try to clean a foul-smelling object that was left in the open, and he threatened me. He works for the government, you know. He said he would use his power against me, against all of us, if we didn't bend to his will. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A few of her allies nodded in sympathy. She was good. She was twisting the narrative, casting me as a threatening government agent, abusing his power, and her as the brave citizen standing up for community values. I let her finish. I let her spin her entire web of lies. When she sat down to a smattering of supportive applause, the board secretary, a man named George, looked at me. Mr. Henderson, he said, his voice hesitant, do you have a response? I stood up. I hadn't brought a briefcase or a file. I just stood there in my shirt and slacks. I waited until the room was completely silent. I do, I said, my voice calm and clear, easily filling the room. Carol is right about one thing. I do work for the government, and my job is to investigate crimes, specifically crimes involving chemicals. I looked around the room, making eye contact with my neighbors, the ones who had been silent. Yesterday, Carol Fletcher did not try to clean my son's shoe. She threw a glass of industrial-grade hydrofluoric acid at it. She did this in close proximity to my 10-year-old disabled son. A gasp went through the room. Carol's face tightened. "This is an outrageous lie," she declared from her seat. I ignored her. Hydrofluoric acid is not a cleaner. It's a chemical weapon in the wrong hands. It dissolves glass, metal, and human tissue. Skin contact with a small amount of the solution Carol used can be fatal. My lab confirmed the substance this morning. I turned my gaze directly to Carol's husband, Robert. The acid was purchased online from an illegal supplier using a gift card that was bought from your home IP address, Robert. The shipment was picked up from a mail drop in Oak Haven 2 weeks ago. We have the security footage of Carol signing for the package. Robert's face went white. He looked at his wife, his mouth agape. "She told me it was for her pottery hobby," he squeaked. "For glazing." Carol shot him a look of pure fury. The mask was slipping. What Carol Fletcher committed yesterday was not a violation of an HOA bylaw. I continued, my voice growing harder. It was a premeditated felony assault. It was the targeted use of a controlled chemical agent. It was an act of profound hatred and violence against a child. I looked around the room again at the stunned faces. You all saw it. You saw her campaign of harassment. You saw her humiliate my son at the pool. You saw her try to steal his property. And you stayed silent. You stayed silent because you were afraid of having a notice put on your door of being fined $50 for leaving your trash cans out too long. You bought into her illusion of harmony, an illusion built on exclusion and cruelty. The silence in the room was a physical weight. Shame was a palpable thing on the faces of my neighbors. The harmony of this creek is a lie if it requires us to sacrifice our decency. I said, my voice dropping, but losing none of its intensity. If it requires us to look away when a child is being bullied. If it requires us to pretend that a chemical attack is just a disagreement between neighbors. As I finished speaking, the main doors of the clubhouse swung open. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, followed by a woman in a sharp suit. She was Detective Miller, my local law enforcement liaison. She held a warrant in her hand. Carol Fletcher. Detective Miller's voice was pure business. You are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and the unlawful possession and use of a prohibited chemical substance. Carol stared, her face a mask of disbelief. The entire room watched frozen as the officers approached the head table. They didn't put her in handcuffs there. They asked her to stand and flanked her as they walked her toward the door. The illusion of her power, so absolute just minutes before, vanished completely. She was just a woman in a navy dress being led away by the police. As she passed me, her eyes met mine. They held no remorse, only a deep, burning, impotent hatred. The aftermath was quiet and swift. Carol's arrest sent a shockwave through the community. Her husband, cleared of direct involvement, but implicated in his willful ignorance, sold their house within a month. The HOA was fundamentally restructured. The thick book of petty regulations was trimmed down to a few sensible pages about property maintenance. The new board president was a kind retired schoolteacher who had been the first person to come to our door the day after the meeting. She hadn't come with excuses. She had come with a warm apple pie and tears in her eyes. "I am so sorry, Alex," she had said. "We failed you. We failed your son. We let fear make us weak." Others followed. People we'd only ever nodded to at the mailbox stopped by to offer their support, to share their own stories of Carol's petty tyrannies. It was an awakening. The ugly incident had lanced a boil, and now the community could finally begin to heal. A few weeks later, there was a package on our doorstep. It was a large, flat box. There was no note. Inside was a new pair of orthopedic shoes for Leo. They were a newer model, lighter, and more flexible than his old ones, with custom details painted on the sides, small, intricate rockets, and stars soaring over a green landscape. Tucked inside one shoe was a gift card to the ice cream shop, signed simply, "From your neighbors." That afternoon, I watched from the porch as Leo walked across the lawn in his new shoes. He wasn't just walking. There was a spring in his step, a confidence I hadn't seen in a long time. He stopped, looked down at the rockets on his feet, and then did a little hop, a small jump of pure, unadulterated joy. The sun was warm on my face. The air of Harmony Creek no longer felt sterile or oppressive. It felt clean. The perfect lawns and neat houses were still there, but they were no longer the point. They were just the backdrop for the quiet, resilient, and deeply human community that was finally learning to live within them. The silence had been broken, replaced by something far better. The sound of kindness, of courage, and of my son's new shoes, carrying him confidently into a brighter day.